The world that would one day be called the Old South was born from heat, soil, and ownership. Cotton and sugar, rice and tobacco. They did not grow by miracle, but by command. Across the riverlands and the deep fields stretched a civilization built upon bondage, where the line between wealth and human life blurred until they became the same currency. Each plantation was a small kingdom, and within its fences every gesture, glance, and breath carried the weight of hierarchy. In this world, whiteness was law, and gender was order. The white man's power was written in ink and iron. The white woman's power, though quieter, threaded itself through every private corridor of the plantation house. Society dressed her in lace and piety, calling her a moral compass in a world of men. Yet behind shutters and veils, the same system that made her an ornament of purity also gave her dominion over the bodies of others. Enslaved people, men, women, and children, were the measure of her husband's fortune, the instruments of her comfort, and sometimes the mirrors of her frustration. The history of slavery is usually told in masculine terms of overseers, whips, and masters. But the presence of white women within that world complicates the portrait. Many were born into it, learning before they could write that obedience came from those whose skin was darker. They managed households the way generals manage armies, issuing commands, enforcing rules, policing boundaries. Yet history's gaze often turned away from them, preferring to see them as victims of patriarchy rather than as participants in domination. Their power was domestic, but it was real. It ruled the kitchens, the nurseries, and the quarters. Within that order, enslaved black men occupied an especially dangerous position. To the white imagination, they were laborers, protectors, threats, and temptations all at once. Stereotypes of strength and subhumanity mingled in the minds of those who claimed ownership over them. The same myths that justified their enslavement also gave rise to fears of their defiance and fantasies of their submission. In public, white society imagined the black man as dangerous. In private, that danger could twist into curiosity, into the dark play of power disguised as desire. But these were not relationships born of choice or romance. They were born of a structure in which consent was impossible. The law said that an enslaved man had no body of his own. He could be punished for saying no, destroyed for resisting, and silenced if he spoke. His vulnerability was complete. If a white woman used him to vent loneliness, anger, or the desire to feel power in a world that denied her agency, the world would not name it a crime. The man would bear the blame in whispers and myth, while she remained untouched by accusation. The plantation became a theater of silence. There were the public rhythms, the bells, the work songs, the sermons. And there was a second rhythm beneath, an unspoken pulse of fear and endurance. Enslaved people learned to read every expression of their owners, the flick of an eye, the tilt of a voice. Behind the house doors, unrecorded things occurred, and afterward, everyone kept working. The cotton was still picked, the ledgers balanced, the fields did not care. Later generations would find fragments of truth only in testimony, rumor, and the margins of diaries. Sometimes a single sentence from a letter hints at an entire life of contradiction. Sometimes it is the absence of words that tells the loudest story. The historian must listen to that silence, to the way it hums between lines, and imagine the men who lived inside it, strong yet powerless, visible yet unnamed. In the mythology of the South, the white woman was placed upon a pedestal called virtue, while the black man was cast as beast or burden. But the pedestal and the chain were part of the same architecture. Both were designed to preserve the illusion of racial order. To question one was to endanger the other. So the myths endured, guarded by fear, gossip, and the law. If you walk the old plantation roads today, the wind still seems to carry memory through the cypress trees. It whispers not of romance and chivalry, but of boundaries crossed and voices lost. The magnolias bloom in beauty, but their roots dig into soil rich with secrets. Every mansion is a reliquary of silence, every porch once watched by eyes that saw too much. That silence, however, would not hold forever. Over time, cracks appeared, in diaries, in abolitionist tracts, in court records that almost by accident revealed the edges of forbidden history. Through them we glimpse the next chapter, the ways in which power, gender, and fear intertwined, and how the private dominion of the plantation mistress became another instrument of enslavement. Power in the slave South was not only enforced by the whip, it was written into parchment and prayer. Every statute, every sermon, every ritual of daily life rehearsed the same lesson: who may command and who must obey. The plantation house stood at the center of this order like a temple of hierarchy. Within its walls, the master's word carried the force of heaven, and the mistress's authority spread through every domestic corner. Even the smallest gesture, a key hung at her waist, a name spoken in anger, reminded the enslaved that no hour of the day belonged to them. The law itself was the overseer's silent partner. In most states of the South, an enslaved person could not testify against a white person in court. His body might bear the wounds of violence, his mind might remember the truth, yet the law decreed that his voice was null. Ownership erased witness. This legal silence protected not only the masters who punished their laborers, but also anyone within the white household who chose to abuse power in secret. The home, in legal language, was private, its ruler unquestioned, its shadows unexamined. For the women of that ruling class, confinement took another shape. They were taught that virtue was obedience to men, that their purity maintained the moral balance of the South. Yet that same system left them powerless in public life. Inside this cage of gentility, many turned their authority inward, toward those who could not resist. The enslaved served as mirrors for emotions that the rigid codes of white society forbade. Rage, humiliation, loneliness, the ache of being owned themselves in every way, except by law. The cruelty of a world that denied them freedom could be displaced onto those whose freedom had already been taken. Plantation diaries sometimes hint at this strange exchange of power. A line about a servant's insolence, a note that someone was sent away, a sudden purchase recorded in an account book. These are fragments through which historians must glimpse entire dramas of domination and fear. Now and then a witness speaks through the veil, a narrative dictated decades later, or a letter by a white observer who saw more than propriety allowed. They tell of moments when control broke its own mask, when the social order trembled behind closed doors. The tone is always the same, uneasy, evasive, as if language itself wished to look elsewhere. In this unspoken landscape, enslaved men bore a double danger. To labor was already to risk punishment, to be noticed was to risk far worse. Any interaction with a white woman, even accidental, could be twisted into accusation or rumor. The mere suspicion of familiarity might mean torture or death. Thus silence became survival. Enslaved people learned to master invisibility, to move as if unseen, to let their thoughts remain locked behind lowered eyes. Yet the same invisibility that kept them alive also trapped them in history's blind spot, where neither guilt nor innocence could be spoken aloud. White society preferred the myth of its own virtue. Writers of the period described plantations as harmonious families, each member knowing his place. Religion sanctified obedience. Literature romanticized the gentle mistress. Even northern visitors, uncomfortable though they were, often recorded only what they were permitted to see: the parlor, the politeness, the well-dressed children. Few dared to imagine the human cost beneath that calm surface. Those who did were dismissed as radicals or liars. But beneath the hymns and manners, the reality remained. A world built upon possession. Every law reinforced it, Every sermon excused it, every silence maintained it. And when emancipation finally came, it did not instantly erase the memory of that possession. It lingered in stories half told, in families broken without record, in the language of shame that followed generations. In the distance, history begins to shift. The Civil War will come, and with it the end of slavery's legal structure. Yet the habits of power, its gendered disguises, its racial hierarchies, will not vanish with the signing of a proclamation. They will reappear in new forms, still wrapped in silence, still shaping lives long after the last plantation crumbles. As the century turns and memory hardens into legend, the truth grows harder to trace. But if one listens closely, to the cadence of old letters, to the bitterness in a freedman's testimony, to the melancholy of Southern folklore, one hears echoes of those unspoken rooms. They remind us that the past is not past. It breathes through the soil, through the stories yet to be told. Freedom arrived not as a sunrise, but as a storm. When the guns fell quiet and the soldiers withdrew, the great plantations stood like emptied theaters, their stages littered with the wreckage of an empire of ownership. The enslaved stepped into an uncertain dawn, carrying nothing but memory. For the first time, the law no longer claimed their bodies. Yet the same soil, the same faces, the same whispered fears remained. A country could end a system, but it could not end the habits of mind that had sustained it. In that first generation after emancipation, many people tried to build new lives from fragments. Churches and schools rose where fields had once bound laborers to the whip. But silence followed them like a ghost. The former masters told stories of loyalty and gentleness to soothe their own loss of power. The former enslaved, wary of danger and disbelief, often kept certain memories unspoken. In a land still ruled by white juries and white violence, to speak too plainly about the old wrongs could be to invite new ones. Thus the record of the private world behind plantation doors remained half-buried, carried only in rumor, guarded by shame and fear. Historians who came later found traces, court petitions, runaway advertisements, diary entries, but the truth was veiled by propriety. The genteel memoirs of Southern women painted themselves as benevolent mistresses, guardians of civilization. Male chroniclers preserved the legend of chivalry and honor. The stories that did not fit, those of domination turned inward, of private tyranny cloaked in lace, were omitted, forgotten, or denied. The silence hardened into myth, yet fragments survived in unexpected places. In letters written by Northern missionaries who taught in the Reconstruction South, in testimonies collected by the Freedmen's Bureau, in the wary recollections of elderly people decades later, each fragment adds a glimmer of understanding, a reminder that the structure of power outlasted the institution itself. The lines between gender and race, fear and desire, remained tangled, shaping how people saw one another and themselves. By the end of the 19th century, a new mythology had taken hold, the image of the threatened white woman and the dangerous black man. It reversed the truth of history, turning victims into villains and erasing the realities of power that had existed for centuries. This myth, broadcast in newspapers and novels, justified fresh violence. Lynchings, segregation, laws designed to protect a purity that had never truly been pure. What had once been private coercion became public paranoia. The lie was easier to tell than the truth, and the nation embraced it. Still, the older generation remembered. In the hush of family gatherings, in songs and folk tales, fragments of the hidden past survived. They told of households ruled by silence, of women whose smiles concealed command, of men who bore invisible wounds. These stories changed with every retelling, blurred by fear and time, yet they preserved the rhythm of endurance. History may forget names, but memory keeps emotion. It passes down not the fact, but the feeling of what was endured. By the early 20th century, scholars began to look back more critically. Some, reading between the lines of plantation records, saw hints of the suppressed. Others, especially writers of the Harlem Renaissance, began to challenge the South's self-portrait, to expose the lies beneath the magnolia-scented myths. They understood that to tell the story of slavery truthfully meant confronting all its forms of domination, not only the whip and the auction block, but also the quieter, more insidious forms of power exercised behind closed doors. And yet, even as truth began to surface, resistance followed. Archives were censored, memoirs were edited, universities hesitated to disturb ancestral legends. The deeper one digs into history, the more one meets the weight of denial. But silence is not emptiness, it is a kind of evidence. The very absence of record marks where fear once lived. Today, when scholars revisit those plantations, they walk through landscapes layered with voices. Some speak of labor, some of punishment, some of endurance. And beneath them all, faint but persistent, is the pulse of unacknowledged suffering. The human cost of a hierarchy that claimed even intimacy as property. The storm of emancipation passed, but its thunder still echoes. The next age would bring migration, segregation, and a new vocabulary of race and gender. The old myths would adapt, concealing the same wounds beneath different names. But for those who listened carefully, to letters, to folklore, to the spaces between words, the past still whispers, insisting that truth, however buried, demands remembrance. Power does not vanish when the law changes. It seeps into the soil, into the stories people tell, into the quiet gestures that pass between generations. On the plantations, hierarchy was both physical and psychological. The mistress's authority was learned in infancy, in the way her father taught her to command the household, in the lessons that told her virtue was her power, and in the unspoken rules that framed her dominion over those who labored under her gaze. For the enslaved, fear and awareness became a survival skill, a language in itself. One glance could warn, one footstep could betray, one silence could save a life. This system of power created legacies that endured long after emancipation. White women carried the memory of constraint, of dependence on social order, of the need to wield influence where they could. Some sought to remake that influence in public roles. Schools, churches, and social organizations became arenas to project authority while maintaining the veneer of virtue. Others internalized it as guilt, forgetting that the structures they had inherited often depended on the oppression of others. For black men, the inheritance was different but no less profound. They bore the memory of bodies and voices silenced, of boundaries enforced by law and custom, of a world in which one could be blamed for the impossibility of consent. Fear, caution, and self-preservation became second nature, transmitted quietly from father to son, neighbor to neighbor. And yet within that fear lay resilience, the ability to endure, to interpret signals, to survive without surrendering one's humanity. Memory became a secret toolkit for life, a way to navigate landscapes still hostile after the formal chains had been removed. The tension between visibility and invisibility shaped every relationship, every social encounter, every memory. White communities remembered themselves as moral, genteel, and virtuous. Black communities remembered survival, endurance, and silent suffering. Between these recollections lay the unspoken, acts of domination that were never confessed, witnessed, or recorded. That unspoken past, layered with shame and secrecy, shaped identity in ways that textbooks cannot fully capture. Psychologically, these experiences created echoes across time. Fear, mistrust, and hyper-awareness became protective mechanisms. They were responses to real dangers, physical, legal, and social, but they also became inherited patterns of interaction. Enslaved men learned early that survival often meant obedience and invisibility. while white women learned that authority could be exercised subtly in ways that left no mark in the law, yet altered lives profoundly. These lessons persisted long after the plantations faded in manners, attitudes, and social expectation. The landscape itself bore witness. Plantations became memory-laden terrain, the grand porches, the shaded hallways, the fields stretching like endless seas of labor. Each tree, each veranda, each shuttered window held stories of command and concealment, of fear and endurance. For the descendants, walking through these spaces was a confrontation with history's invisible weight. Even when the people were gone, the echoes of hierarchy lingered, shaping how power and gender were understood, remembered, and sometimes repeated. Art, literature, and oral history became tools for deciphering these hidden structures. Writers and storytellers began to explore the psychology of power and the subtleties of domination. Songs hummed with grief and memory. Folktales encoded warnings and strategies for survival. Memoirs captured the faint outlines of lives constrained by systems of authority. Within these cultural forms, the silent stories of private oppression survived, waiting to be interpreted, acknowledged, and understood. By the early 20th century, the story of slavery had become a public narrative, often simplified, often sanitized. But beneath the surface, the private legacies persisted. They shaped communities, behaviors, and expectations. They informed relationships, influenced perceptions of masculinity and femininity, and dictated who could speak and who would be heard. The echoes of power, fear, and survival resonated far beyond the plantation, tracing a lineage of unspoken rules that touched generations who never saw the cotton fields but inherited their memory. History, in this sense, is a living presence, not a closed book. Memory is sedimented like layers of earth, each generation excavating what it can, encountering fragments and shadows, piecing together the rhythm of lives constrained by domination and survival. The past does not demand attention with violence. It whispers, lingers, and waits to be interpreted. And in listening to those whispers, we begin to understand not only what was endured, but the ways in which endurance shapes identity, culture, and legacy. The next chapter moves beyond memory into the broader currents of society. The ways these silent hierarchies, these inherited patterns of power and fear, flowed into the structures of segregation, migration, and social expectation. The echoes of domination did not vanish with freedom. They transformed, adapting to new laws, new towns, new schools, and new myths. And in understanding that transformation, we confront the persistence of history itself. History rarely ends. It folds in upon itself, layering memory over memory, shadow over shadow. The plantations may have been abandoned, their fields turned to dust, yet the structures of domination endured in ways subtler than chains and whips. Laws changed, but habits persisted. Social hierarchies were redrawn, yet the ghosts of invisible coercion lingered in classrooms, workplaces, churches, and homes. What had once been private authority became social expectation, a network of rules and silences that shaped entire communities. For black men, the legacy was complex. Freedom provided mobility, education, and the opportunity to rebuild lives, yet it did not erase the inherited awareness of power imbalances. The need for vigilance, the instinct to navigate unseen threats, the understanding that one's body and voice could still be contested. All of these patterns were passed down, not through textbooks, but through storytelling, song, and quiet example. The memory of domination, though never spoken in full, remained encoded in gestures, in caution, in survival strategies that persisted through the decades. White women also carried inherited legacies. Their authority, once confined to household and plantation, found new forms in civic organizations, in social clubs, in education and philanthropy. The same subtle command that shaped the lives of enslaved people now shaped classrooms and charitable institutions, often unconsciously. Even as society lauded progress and reform, echoes of the old hierarchies remained, woven into expectations of gender, race, and propriety. In literature and folklore, these tensions emerged as coded narratives. Southern novels and oral histories preserved stories of power, fear, and endurance. Heroes and villains were often miscast, morality simplified, and history romanticized. Yet beneath the myth, attentive readers can trace the real human experiences. Men navigating constrained freedom, women wielding subtle authority, and families bearing the emotional weight of centuries. Culture became both shield and mirror, revealing the persistence of domination while softening its harsh edges for public consumption. The legacy extends into the structures of modern society. Segregation, discriminatory laws, and economic disparities were not born in isolation. They were extensions of centuries-old hierarchies. Patterns of authority, control, and visibility, taught on plantations, refined in households, continued to shape who was seen, who was heard, and who could claim agency. Even when legal equality was codified, social memory carried habits of dominance and silence, guiding behavior in invisible ways that were difficult to measure yet impossible to ignore. Psychologically, these legacies left traces in both communities. Black men inherited resilience and caution, an acute awareness of the consequences of being seen and of speaking. White women inherited lessons of control and propriety, sometimes unaware of the roots of their authority or the cost borne by those over whom it was exercised. Across generations, the echoes of the plantation informed interactions, shaping relationships, expectations, and self-perception in ways that only careful observation could detect. Yet there is also a possibility of reclamation. By listening to the silences, by interpreting the fragments left in archives, letters, and oral histories, society can begin to understand the hidden dynamics that shaped lives. Recognition does not undo the past, but it illuminates the human stories long neglected by dominant narratives. It allows descendants to confront inherited trauma and power, to reflect on the ways history molds perception and behavior, and to reclaim agency in interpreting the past. As the 20th century unfolded, voices increasingly challenged the old myths. Scholars, writers, and activists began exposing the subtler forms of domination, the quiet coercion, the layers of fear and control that had persisted long after emancipation. They revealed that history was not simply a tale of masters and slaves, of black and white, but of power exercised in rooms and hallways, in silence and absence, in patterns that could outlive legal structures. Every new study, every recovered narrative, chipped away at the illusion of innocence, demanding acknowledgement of the complexity of human experience. The echoes of the past continue to resonate. Walking the plantations today, one hears them faintly in the wind through the trees, in the shadows cast by the columns, in the hidden corridors of memory. They remind us that history is lived as much as it is written, that domination and endurance coexist, that silence can speak as loudly as words. And they urge us to look beyond the surface, to confront the invisible hierarchies that have shaped and continue to shape the way we understand race, gender, and power. The next chapter will close this narrative with reflection, a meditation on memory, myth, and the responsibility to witness history fully. It will ask how the unspoken past informs the present, and how acknowledgement and remembrance can honor those whose lives were constrained by invisible chains. It is a chapter of pause, of resonance, and of cautious hope, bridging history and memory as one continuous story. History is never finished. It lingers in the spaces we pass through, in the shadows of buildings, in the cadence of stories whispered from one generation to the next. The plantations of the Old South, long emptied of their laborers and masters, still breathe with memory. Every shuttered window, every creaking floorboard, every magnolia-shaded veranda is a vessel of the lives once contained within. And among those lives were the ones rarely recorded, the ones whose experiences were hidden behind the law of silence, behind the expectations of virtue and propriety, behind the myth of innocence. The enslaved men who endured coercion, domination, and the constant threat of violence left no public testimony of their suffering in many cases. Yet their endurance speaks louder than words ever could. It echoes in survival, in resilience, in the capacity to navigate a world that rendered them invisible, even as it observed them constantly. They are remembered not only in fragments of letters, in diaries, in court records, but in the very patterns of life that followed, in the cautious steps and quiet wisdom passed down through families in the rhythm of memory itself. White women of the plantation households were likewise shaped by forces that combined restriction with authority. Their roles, complex and contradictory, remind us that power exists in many forms, and that history often disguises its subtler manifestations. Their authority, exercised in private corridors, could command, intimidate, and shape lives, yet it remained invisible to law and history alike. The myths surrounding them, of gentility, virtue, and moral guardianship, softened the harsh reality of domination, obscuring the ways in which control could be exerted quietly, yet profoundly, on those who had no recourse. In confronting this past, we encounter silence as both barrier and testimony. The absence of record, the careful omissions of diaries and letters, the deliberate forgetting in public memory, all of these are evidence of history's complexity. They remind us that human experience is rarely fully documented, that power and fear often operate beyond the reach of ink and paper, and that listening to what is unspoken can reveal truths that conventional records cannot. Memory, myth, and history intertwine in the telling of these stories. The mythic imagination allows us to grasp the emotional truth of lives constrained by forces beyond their control. The historical record gives us the context, the dates, the laws, the economic and social structures that shaped behavior. Together they form a lens through which we can begin to understand the subtle, pervasive ways power and domination operated, and the enduring human resilience that resisted it, quietly, patiently, across generations. To walk through these stories is to confront both horror and hope. Horror in the acknowledgement of oppression, exploitation, and the silences that concealed them. Hope in the realization that human memory, though fragile, can preserve truth, and that acknowledgement, however delayed, allows for justice of a kind, the justice of understanding, the justice of remembrance, the justice of giving voice to those long silenced. And so, the plantations, the fields, the corridors, and the porches are not merely relics of the past. They are mirrors, reflecting the complexity of power, gender, and race, and the consequences of their intersections. They invite reflection, demanding that we see not only what was done, but how it shaped what came after. To walk through them today is to listen, to feel, to reckon, and to carry forward the stories that history almost forgot. The past is not behind us. It persists in memory, in legacy, and in the ongoing effort to confront truth, however uncomfortable, however long buried. As we step away from these magnolia-scented shadows, we take with us both knowledge and responsibility. Knowledge of the systems that permitted domination, knowledge of the silences that concealed suffering, knowledge of the endurance that resisted them. Responsibility to remember, to teach, and to illuminate the spaces history left unrecorded. In acknowledging the hidden truths, in tracing the echoes of past power, we honor those whose lives were constrained, and we shape a future more conscious of the ways history's invisible chains continue to influence us all. The story does not end here. Every whispered memory, every recovered record, every reflection on the past keeps history alive. By listening carefully, by observing the spaces between recorded events, and by giving voice to the silences, we continue the work of uncovering truth. A truth that shapes how we understand freedom, power, and human resilience. The past persists, but through remembrance, understanding, and reflection, it can illuminate a path forward, ensuring that the stories of the silenced are finally heard.